the Viking era. Drinking water could be as lethal as facing a sword on the battlefield. The rivers dragged along debris. The lakes hid remains of animals, and the wells could become invisible traps. One sip was enough to bring down a warrior, break a mother, or condemn a child in the endless winters. However, the peoples of the north did not surrender. With ingenuity and patience, they transformed nature into their best ally, creating surprising methods to purify water and keep an entire community alive. Chapter 1. The Cloth That Held Back Death. In the northern lands where the rains dyed the rivers with mud, and the lakes accumulated dead leaves and remains of animals, the water was both blessing and threat. Drinking without care could weaken a warrior on the march or drag an entire family toward fever. Without doctors or safe remedies, the only defense was careful observation and ingenuity. From that need was born a solution as simple as it was brilliant: filtering the water with a cloth. A piece of linen woven on communal looms or thick wool was enough to become the first wall against dirt. Before drinking, the liquid had to pass through the fibers, and in that silent gesture, the resistance of an entire clan was decided. Travelers who ventured into remote fjords carried with them a piece of clean cloth with the same care with which they guarded a knife or a flint. A sword served against a visible enemy, a cloth against that which crawled secretly through the guts. When filtering, the cloth trapped mud, larvae, and remains of plants. The resulting water was not perfect, but it was clear enough to instill confidence amid the uncertainty. Inside the longhouses, some families perfected the system, placing several vessels at different heights and stretching cloths between them. The water descended slowly, clearer in each container, while gravity did its work. The children grew up seeing this daily ritual and learned that drinking directly from a puddle was a reckless act. In winter, the difference was evident. The clans that filtered resisted fevers better than those who drank without precaution. The skalds remembered it in their songs as a symbol of prudence, and some clans added a double layer: wool for the thick, linen for the fine. The result was a less fetid liquid, enough to sustain the morale of the village. The key was in the height and in the time. The higher the initial container, the greater the pressure to pass through the cloth, the slower the drip, the better the impurities were trapped, without spending firewood or metal. This filter could be repeated over and over, both inside a house and in an improvised camp. But the Vikings knew that this technique was only the first line of defense. The water could look clear and still hide evils that no cloth could stop. That is why, when the cloth was not enough, they looked toward the trees and discovered that the sap held another secret. Chapter 2. The Sap That Filtered Life. In the northern forests, where the birches shone silver under the moon and the willows bent their branches toward the streams, the Vikings discovered that trees could be more than wood for building or firewood for the home. Inside their trunks beat a secret that could mark the difference between life and death: their natural capacity to filter water. On long journeys, boiling water was not always possible. The firewood had to be reserved for the central fire. The cauldrons were scarce and heavy, and time was pressing. It was then that observation became salvation. When cutting a green branch and pouring turbid water through its interior, the liquid emerged clearer, free of much of the mud, and with a harsh but reliable taste. The internal tissue of the wood, designed by nature to transport sap, acted as a biological filter. Each fiber retained particles, remains of insects, and sediments. The resulting water was not perfect, but it was enough for a hunter to remain standing in the middle of a frozen forest, or for a warrior to maintain strength on the march. Not all trees offered the same gift. The birch, revered in many villages, produced a fine filtrate with a strong, almost medicinal taste. The willow, more humble, delivered a neutral water, although less abundant. In regions where alders and cypresses grew, the water acquired a fresh nuance that many considered a sign of purity. This knowledge was not common to all clans. It was transmitted among explorers and hunters, who depended most on drinking far from the family wells. In the solitude of the forests, a fragment of green branch could be worth as much as a sword. The elders narrated it with solemnity. The tree that gives shade can also give life. The procedure required patience. A branch was cut. The outer bark was removed, and it was oriented in the same direction in which the sap ran. The contaminated water was poured slowly at one end, and from the other it fell drop by drop, clearer and less dangerous. The taste of wood was inevitable, but the relief of drinking without getting sick overcame any harshness. Some clans even combined techniques. First the cloth, then the branch. The double filtering offered greater security. And for sailors and merchants, it could be the difference between reaching a port or being left prostrate on the way. But the Vikings understood that neither cloth nor branches guaranteed total victory. The water continued to be a cunning enemy, and what seemed safe could still hide death. It was then that they devised a more ambitious method to build filters of sand and charcoal that imitated the earth itself. Chapter 3. The sand that guarded the secret of purity. In the more stable settlements where the longhouses resisted generation after generation, and the clans depended on the same wells year after year, the need for reliable water led to more elaborate solutions. The rains dragged mud to the springs. The animals contaminated the streams, and the wells became invisible traps. Neither the cloth nor the branch was enough. It was necessary to imitate the earth itself. The Vikings had observed that when filtering slowly through sandy soils, the rainwater emerged clear in deep springs. From that observation, the idea of building rustic filters, true works of patience and precision, was born. In large vessels or in excavated deposits, they placed stones at the bottom, then layers of increasingly fine sand. And finally, vegetable charcoal prepared with care. The water descended slowly, freeing itself from its fetid smell and its turbid appearance until it transformed into an almost new liquid. The charcoal was the key. It was produced by burning hard wood in fires covered with earth, which limited the oxygen. The result was a black, light, and porous material capable of absorbing invisible impurities. To the touch, it seemed fragile, but it held a silent power to return freshness to the water. The Vikings considered it a gift from the fire, as valuable for life as for the forging of swords. The design was simple, but it demanded discipline. If the water ran too fast, it did not purify well. If the filter was not cleaned, it became saturated. That is why it was the task of the entire community to renew it, to change the upper sand when it darkened, and to keep the constant flow alive. A neglected filter was a dead filter, and in winter, that negligence could cost lives. In the ports, where the streams filled with filth after the passage of ships and animals. These filters became collective guardians. Each vessel full of clean water was a silent triumph, a reminder that observation and patience could subdue disease without the need for metals or cauldrons. The Vikings even defined a practical rule that was transmitted through generations: double step, double security. First the cloth, then the sand and the charcoal. That combination reduced risks and offered confidence amid the uncertainty. But there were evils that resisted even this system. Some fevers continued to lurk, and it was not enough to imitate the earth. It was necessary to resort to the most brutal power they knew: the fire. Red-hot stones submerged in wooden or leather containers rose as the last wall against the invisible. If this video is liking you, give it a like and subscribe. Chapter 4. The fire that boiled inside the wood. The fire was the heart of Viking life. It lit the forges where swords were forged, heated the long houses on endless nights, and illuminated the banquets after battle. But it could also become the last guardian against an invisible enemy. The contaminated water. Where the cloth and the sand were not enough, the extreme heat rose as the final defense. The problem was evident. The iron or copper cauldrons were too valuable to waste on boiling water. The metal was reserved for weapons, tools, and trade. No one was going to risk an expensive container in daily use. And yet, necessity forced it. The clans then found an ancestral ingenuity to heat stones until they were red hot and submerge them in containers of wood, hardened leather, or hollowed trunks. The scene was overwhelming. Blackened stones by the fire rose with improvised tongs before being thrown into the water. The contact was a burst of steam, a roar that seemed like the wrath of Thor discharging his hammer. The water bubbled violently, and each stone maintained the boiling for a few minutes. By introducing several successively, they managed to sustain the boil silently. Not all rocks served. Those that kept moisture inside could explode into incandescent fragments, putting at risk those who handled them. Experience taught them to choose river stones hardened by centuries of current. That choice became norm and proverb. Not every stone is worthy of entering the water. This method did not depend on luxuries. It was enough fire, stones, and patience. It could be practiced in an improvised camp, in the middle of a forest, or even on a drakkar on the high seas. For many clans, it was the difference between continuing to advance or succumbing to fever. The practical mixed with the symbolic. Some whispered prayers when submerging the rocks, convinced that the heat carried with it the power of the gods. Drinking from that water was not only an act of survival, it was receiving a blessing. However, the fire had a price. It required abundant fuel, suitable stones, and time. On long journeys or quick expeditions, it was not always possible to light fires or carry heavy rocks. That is why the Vikings sought a lighter alternative, a portable tool that accompanied warriors and merchants on their journeys, the filtration bags. Chapter 5. The bags that saved lives on the road. The Viking people were made of movement. Their lives passed between endless journeys. Expeditions in drakkars that crossed uncertain seas. Trade routes that crossed forests and mountains. Quick incursions into foreign lands. On each journey, the water was as essential as the iron of their weapons. The barrels loaded at the beginning were not always enough, and the liquid could corrupt under the sun or the rocking of the sea. In those moments, thirst became an enemy more fearsome than any army. From that need arose an ingenious innovation, the portable filtration bags made of linen or hemp. They functioned as flexible water skins that hung from the belt or from the saddle. Inside, they carried alternating layers of sand and vegetable charcoal separated by fine cloths. It was enough to pour turbid water into the upper part and wait. Drop by drop, the liquid descended until it came out clearer through a small hole at the base. The process was slow but vital. The resulting water was not perfect, but it was clean enough to return strength to an exhausted warrior or to a merchant who still had leagues of road to travel. A bag hanging at the side could mark the difference between arriving alive at the destination or collapsing in the middle of the route. The cleaning was also simple. The layers were emptied. They were rinsed and refilled. They did not replace the communal filters of the villages, but offered immediate security amid the uncertainty. That is why they became indispensable for sailors who could not waste firewood on the high seas, and for explorers who traveled unknown lands with no company other than their ingenuity. Some bags were adorned with amber beads or engraved runes, as if the ancient words reinforced their protective power. They were not just containers. They were passed from father to son as a reminder that foresight could save as many lives as a sword, even in the hardest incursions, where the warriors marched light with shield, axe, and a travel bread. These silent bags sustained the group. In rivers poisoned by putrefaction or pestilent swamps, they offered a last resource against thirst. But the Vikings knew that filtering was not enough. The stored water could corrupt again, become bitter, and sicken those who trusted it. It was then that they resorted to a secret they already knew in the forge and in commerce: the silent force of metals. Chapter 6. The silent force of silver and copper. In the Viking world, the metals were more than useful objects. They were symbols of power and prestige. The silver circulated in cut bracelets or in foreign coins brought from Byzantium and the Caliphate. The copper, more modest, served in vessels, cauldrons, and ornaments. But both hid a secret that few understood, and that, however, became an unwritten law. They could keep the water fresh and free of corruption for longer. The sailors knew it well. Before setting sail, they filled the barrels with previously filtered water and threw inside fragments of silver, often worn coins or broken pieces of bracelets. The metal rested at the invisible bottom, while the liquid resisted better the heat of summer and the rocking of the sea. No one understood the cause, but repeated experience confirmed it. Where there was silver, there was less disease. The copper, although less valuable, also offered benefits. In prosperous villages, water was stored in containers of this metal, which remained fresh and with a nuance that people associated with cleanliness. Many believed that drinking from copper vessels strengthened the body, as if the energy of the metal passed to the water and from there to whoever drank it. This knowledge was transmitted with solemnity. Some clans considered silver a divine gift, an incorruptible metal capable of preserving the pure. There were no lack of those who engraved protective runes on the containers, convinced that in this way they multiplied its power, although they had no words to speak of bacteria or microorganisms. The tradition had built its own truth. The water stored in contact with metals sickened with less frequency. The differences were clear in practice. While some villages suffered outbreaks of fever after drinking water stored in common barrels, others resisted thanks to these guardian metals. The copper and silver did not replace the previous filtering, but added a silent barrier against the passage of time. The surprising thing is that this custom was not limited to survival. It also had a symbolic value. Drinking from a silver container was considered a sign of status, but at the same time a shared protection in banquets and journeys. The practical gesture merged with the sacred. However, the Vikings did not stop observing the world around them. They noticed that in ponds where lilies and reeds grew, the water remained clearer and less fetid. Chapter 7. The secret power of the ponds. The Vikings not only trusted fire, metal, or cloth, they also knew how to read the silent signs of nature. Where the streams stagnated, forming small lagoons, or where the rain accumulated in depressions of the terrain, they discovered an unexpected ally: the aquatic plants. Reeds, lilies, and riverside herbs seemed to transform the turbid water into a clearer liquid, as if they absorbed the dirt in silence. The villages that lived near swamps had noticed it. The water collected next to the reeds smelled less, tasted fresher, and sickened with less frequency those who drank it. Although the Vikings were unaware of the internal processes of those roots, they understood that they were natural guardians. That is why many clans fenced small ponds and left them in the hands of nature itself. Some took one step further. They dug artificial ponds near the longhouses, lined them with clay, and let the rain fill them. Around them, they planted herbs considered givers of life. Thus, the water that reached the clay containers had already passed through a living filter. The symbolism was inevitable. Drinking from a pond surrounded by lilies was, for some, receiving a favor from Freya, goddess of fertility, or from Njord, lord of the sea. The practical intertwined with the sacred. The clear water was a sign that the earth was on their side. The method had another advantage. It required little human effort. Unlike the sand filters that required constant cleaning or the incandescent stones that needed abundant firewood, the ponds with plants maintained themselves almost alone. It was only necessary to watch that the animals did not dirty them and that the herbs grew strong. The rest was done by time. In times of siege or war, these ponds became strategic reserves. When the wells were poisoned or the rivers contaminated by the enemies, a protected pond could sustain an entire community. For many clans, that green mirror was more than water. It was hope. The certainty that even in times of violence, nature still offered refuge. But the Vikings knew that they could not always count on plants and ponds. When winter froze, the earth and resources were scarce. It was necessary to resort to a simpler strategy, to let time do its part. Thus was born the practice of slow decantation. If this video is liking you, give it a like and subscribe. Chapter 8, The Time is Filter, in the life of the Vikings, where speed could decide victories and defeats. There were also moments when patience became a secret weapon. The contaminated water did not always require fire, sand, or metals. Sometimes it was enough to let time work in silence. Thus was born the practice of slow decantation, an elemental art that transformed the turbid into hope. The clans that lacked clean cloths, charcoal, or enough firewood filled large clay vessels or wooden tubs with turbid water and left them to rest. With the passing of the hours, and even better if they were days, the surface became clearer while the heavy fell to the bottom. Above remained life. Below, the disease. The discipline was key. It was necessary to tilt the container with care and extract the upper layer without stirring the sediment. A mistake could ruin hours of waiting. The elders taught this gesture as a simple rite. The impure sinks, the pure floats. Thus the new generations learned to drink with respect and patience. In the hardest winters, when each branch had to be reserved for the fire of the home, the decantation became indispensable. While the families slept next to the heat of the central fire, the water rested in a dark corner, clearing its appearance during the night. At dawn, the bowls received a less dangerous liquid, enough to sustain another day. Some clans combined this method with others. After letting the water rest, they filtered it with a cloth or made it pass through a freshly cut branch. The result was even more reliable, although the wait demanded patience. For the Vikings, every hour invested meant health gained. The symbolism was also present. For the Skalds, the decantation represented a lesson of life. The heavy and corrupt always ends at the bottom, while the clear remains on the surface. Drinking from that upper layer was, in a certain way, drinking the very essence of survival. But patience was not enough everywhere. In mountainous regions and volcanoes, the Vikings discovered that the rock itself could serve as a filter. Porous stones, carved or used in their natural state, had the power to trap the dirt and return clarity drop by drop. Time once again offered its help. But now through the stone. Chapter 9. The stone that drank the dirt. In the mountainous lands reached by some Viking clans, the rock not only served to raise walls or sharpen tools, There were stones that guarded a secret more valuable than iron. They could filter the water. At first sight, they seemed inert blocks, but inside they hid a tiny network of channels capable of trapping the dirt and returning clarity. The discovery arose from observation. When pouring turbid water over certain porous rocks, it descended slowly and at the other end dripped clearer. The process despaired the thirsty. Each drop took time to arrive, but the result was undeniable. The muddy was left behind and the liquid recovered freshness. Some clans began to carve cylinders of volcanic or limestone stone, creating rudimentary deposits where the water descended drop by drop. Others took advantage of natural cavities, placing vessels underneath to collect the filtered. The rhythmic sound of those drops hitting the wood or the clay became a symbol of resistance and patience. With time, the Vikings noticed that the interior of the stones developed an invisible film that seemed to improve the filtering even more. They could not explain it, but they interpreted that change as proof that the rock had spirit, a silent guardian that fought against corruption. Some skalds even said that these stones were gifts from the Jotuns, ancient giants that shared with men fragments of their power. The maintenance was simple but essential. It was necessary to scrape the surface from time to time to free the pores and maintain the flow. Neglecting this gesture transformed the filter into a dead block. Caring for it instead could make it last generations. Thus, a fragment of worked rock was transmitted as inheritance, as valuable as a sword or a silver bracelet. In times of siege, these stones were invisible weapons. When the wells were poisoned or the rivers contaminated by the enemies, a porous block could sustain an entire village. Each collected drop represented a discrete victory against thirst and disease. But even the stone had limits. The filtered water had to be stored with intelligence, because time and air could corrupt it again. The Vikings understood that the last defense was not in the cloth, in the branch, or in the rock, but in the art of storing what was already purified. Chapter 10. The art of keeping water against time. The Vikings understood that purifying the water was only half the battle. The other half began afterward, when what was already clear had to resist time and air without becoming bitter. Thus was born a silent and meticulous art, the intelligent storage. In the longhouses, the coolest and darkest corners kept wooden tubs sealed with pine pitch. There, where the air barely circulated, the water remained clear for longer. In villages with clay soils, they excavated pits lined with compacted mud, where they placed vessels covered with heavy lids and tanned skins. The darkness and the cold were allies as important as the cloth or the charcoal. In the drakers, the barrels were placed in the lowest part of the ship, protected from the sun and the movement of the deck. Their fragments of silver or copper nails rested at the bottom, prolonging the freshness of the water during weeks of crossing. On dry land, the clans collected the rain with wooden or bark channels, discarding the first dirty waters and keeping only the purest in clean containers. The maintenance was law. Each vessel had to be washed with salt and ash, rinsed with care, and resealed with resin. A crack, no matter how small, could ruin all the effort. There was no magic, only discipline. Caring for the water was caring for life, and that invisible work sustained entire villages during endless winters. Thus, drop by drop, the Vikings built their resistance, not with miracles, but with ingenuity, patience, and respect for nature. In a world of iron and blood, they understood that survival also depended on a simple barrel of water well kept. Because the cruelest enemy does not always wield a sword. Sometimes it hides in a drop, waiting for the careless. And those who learned to defeat it were able to raise ships, conquer coasts, and leave a mark that still resonates in our history. If this Viking secret surprised you, do not stop here. On our channel, you will find more exciting stories about how these peoples faced enemies.